Greetings, all. Welcome back to another episode of the Coptimizer podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Flanley, retired chief of police, and I've got another amazing guest. Right? They're all amazing because who's going to invite someone on their show and be like, "Yeah, I've got a really boring show for you today." But that is definitely not the case today, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation with Dick Odom. Um, and Dick is a former police officer. He is an author and former business owner. And his story is it's it's kind of wild, man. It's wild. This is the kind of story that they write movies about, and I'm looking forward to digging into this. But thanks for your time. I appreciate you being here.
Oh, no, I appreciate you having me on, Pat. I've been looking forward to it, and certainly, talking about my books and helping. What did you say? Get that story out there.
Yeah, yeah.
That let's say it's unremarkably unique.
I don't know about that. And when I say they write movies like this, like in just a little teaser, sometimes as the cop, we can be the hero or we can be the anti-hero. We can be the antagonist and the protagonist in the same story. And a lot of it is just based on decisions that you make in the moment and what your role is. And your role in really evolved to where you became an undercover police officer and you were working some pretty cool stuff, but living kind of that dual lifestyle. And there might have been a little bit of mission creep that took you down a dark path. And I think the lesson here today, there's lots of them, but primarily the one is, you always, well, trust in God, right? I mean, I think that's a big one. When we lose sight of that, sometimes we can go down dark paths. But I think maybe from a more introspective and just kind of if you want to dig into it, right? There's a little bit of this in all of us, and we all have the potential for good. We all have the potential for evil, and yeah, I mean, as cops. It sometimes you're walking a tightrope. You're walking a
Oh,
tightrope. So we're going to dig into that, but let's before we get into that, maybe a little bit of background about, where you're from, where you grew up, kind of what led you into policing in the first place.
oh yeah, absolutely. I was born in Alabama. Let's just say a few days ago, and my
I
father was in the military.
I won't say roll tide, but
Well, I used to be a diehard Auburn fan, but one year they were on probation. They had a really awesome year. And the next year they were on probation. They just killed it. And then the next year they're off probation, finally on TV back again. And I watched them in a game against LSU, and they lost so badly. I burned every Auburn memorabilia piece I had that day. It was just horrible. So, but Alabama is where it started. My father was in the military, and so I moved around a lot as a young man, as a child, right? I think I lived there in Maxwell Air Force Base. My father was stationed there for a couple of years, and then off to Korea for a couple of years. So this is in the 70s, and then we ended up at Fort Benning, Georgia, and then we went to Okinawa, Japan, and then I went back to Fort Benning, Georgia, and ended up in Enterprise, Alabama, where I graduated high school. So my childhood was kind of, let's just say it had its trials, right? You can
right.
read all about that. I mean, I talk a little bit about it in the 99% Outlaw, but it talked more about it in my first book, The Oathbreaker. Um, and when I graduated high school, like in high school, I knew already I wanted to be a cop. I mean, I joined the Army Reserves while I was in high school, delayed entry program, all that good stuff. Because I was in ROTC, they were like, well, you need to start going to drill right away. So my senior year of high school, I was already, interacting with military police officers. So high school, graduate, go off to basic AIT. Um, I ended up going active duty, leaving the Army Reserves, and then November 1990, my wife and I got married very young, and we're still married. Same two people, right? This year is 34 years. So
Congrats.
uh,
Yeah.
thank you. That's been a tough one, right? My wife has struggled a lot through that time. So God's grace is there. We have to be thankful for that. Um, the my law enforcement career was 17 years. I spent my time in predominantly I was a dog handler. And the last I got into that within a year of getting out of the military and becoming a civilian police officer in Alabama. I was a dog handler and it just kind of took off and I loved it. It was just every day. That's all I wanted to do was people call it working, I called it playing. I mean, I didn't care if I was wearing a bite suit or getting rammed to the ground by a dog, an 80-pound Malinois with a muzzle on. That was okay too. That was cool, right?
Right.
But it developed into a position that I became a canine trainer. And the agency, the last agency I worked for there in Alabama, we had 9 dog teams. And so that's my law enforcement career, right? After 17 years, one night I said, hey, I had enough of this. It kind of was coming on, I think, for a little while, and decided I was going to go out and drive my motorcycle to a bridge abutment. That didn't happen. I woke up in the middle of the road with a sergeant from my own agency giving me a sternum rub, right? So that was my law enforcement career. After that night, I said, this is where the title, the Oathbreaker, originated from. I always felt
Okay.
like I had really, really dishonored the profession, and caused it so much damage that, returning to it just wasn't in me. And the part that hurt about that, Pat, though, is I still yet, during this time, we know the stoicism of law enforcement, right? Be
Yes.
quiet, keep your head down. So what if you're hurt? Um, well, I maintained that attitude when I went on to build a business that, well, I sold $13,000 worth of chicken shit and I had cashed out my retirement and everything in Alabama, moved to Arkansas and bought a poultry farm. So I was like, okay, my career's over with law enforcement. I'm starting over. And I went all in. Um, I went all in financially. I didn't go all in mentally, other than the drive to build the business. I mean, it was you build a business of that size, it takes 16 hours a day for years. And you got to put that in. Nobody's standing there holding your hand, going to help you with it. But I didn't, as much as I'd been through other things, I don't think there was part of it that I had taken care of. And in 2017, I had built the company to where last year we did $15.2 million. Well, that attracts a lot of attention. Competitors, bankers, because I didn't still reach out after my law enforcement career, say, I need help. See, I kept all of this stuff in. I'm holding it all in. I'm still not talking to anybody. Well, in the end, I just couldn't fight anymore, right? I end up in a hostile sale of my company and lose everything I own again. So 2017 sucked, but it would get worse. 2019, my mother would pass away within 3 weeks of us finding out she had cancer. And I was already isolated at home. That just sent me like deeper into that because my mother and I are very close. If as people get to read about my books, they'll see that my childhood it was kind of tumultuous, right? And my mother, I've learned through writing these books, was my protector in general. And when she was gone, I kind of fell apart. So the last 7 years, I've been in isolation, working from home, doing what I can do, but still having, still dealing with a lot. But that's me in a nutshell, right? Policeman, businessman, but keep standing. They knock you down, stand up. They knock you down, stand up. That's how I think now.
Well, I want to go back to something you said a couple minutes ago when you were giving us that background. You talked about waking up in the middle of the road, getting a sternum rub. but we didn't necessarily talk about what happened there. You're on a motorcycle and we
Right.
run into a bridge abutment, and the question that's dangling out there, was this an accident, or was it intentional, or was it just a moment where that idea pops into your mind that
No.
there could be an easy way out? So what was it?
So that night, I had the last year before that was really tough on me. I was going through a lot of I was fighting my own demons constantly every day. I'd become an alcoholic. I mean, if I wasn't at work, I was drinking. And then it got to the point I was leaving work to drink, right? Now, um, I had developed my lower back had developed some problems few years before, and I'd gotten addicted to hydrocodone. And when you start adding those in with bad behavior, right? Um, it's going to take a toll on you, your family. I was, dealing with infidelity, and at a certain point, I just gave up, Pat. I said, this is enough. And one night, one of my friends, well, let me say this, because I'm very big. Everybody talks about accountability. You need to take personal responsibility for your actions. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. But if you want to call me friend, brother, however you want to term it, and you see me jacked up doing something really stupid, and you're not going to come grab me up and say, hey, brother, you're an alcoholic, I want to help you, you're really not my friend anymore, right? If you don't have the courage to come to me when I'm endangering myself, we're really just acquaintances now, right? But now, with that being said, I made every mistake you can make, right? I left the house that night. This guy called me. He said, "Hey, let's go out tonight." And I had been staying home at that time for probably a month and being really quiet. But I was drinking every night at home, right? I mean, it was just constant drinking. So I decided, yeah, I'll go. So I got on my bike and I took off, and me and him went and had a beer. And then he said, well, I'm going home. And by the time I jumped on my bike, I already knew my plan. I was going to go get drunk that night and drive into a bridge abutment. It was a fairly simple process in my mind. When I got so drunk, I left the bar and ended up going down into town and just wrecking in the middle of Main Street. I don't even remember the last half a mile I drove, Pat. There's an intersection there now in that city in Alabama that it's pretty much the center of the city. And I turned and was going back out the highway, and I don't even remember any of that, right? So then I wake up at the sternum rub from this guy. Yeah, I left the house that night with the intent on dying. I mean, and I talk about it in the first book. When I woke up, I mean, I was pissed at it and I was mad. And I write about that in depth. It just was a bad situation. It got worse. My agency didn't help. I did 2 months before that happened go in and tell my agency that I had drinking problems. I'm an alcoholic. I got infidelity issues. I got this. Within 5 minutes, the lieutenant who I was talking to says, and I'll quote this, right? So, from Odom, what in the hell do you want me to do about this? I said, you know what, Lieutenant? I don't want you to do a damn thing for me. And I turned around and walked out. Because it was I'll say this, that was not the defining factor of me attempting suicide, Pat, but it damn sure didn't help, right?
Right.
After that, the guy reports me to internal affairs. Now I got some lieutenant following me around like I don't see this nut, right? Um, so rather than come and show compassion, and this particular chief, he was new, he'd been there like a year, he was destroying the agency. Right now, this particular man, I believe, is under indictment in the state of Georgia for a lot of nefarious activities. But in the end, right, I made those mistakes. They're my mistakes. I own them. I did it. But sometimes this is why I'm big about accountability, because when you have a lieutenant look you in the face and say, what the hell you want me to do about it? I'm going to start calling people out, right? It's just simple as that. If you don't have the courage to be a leader, get the hell out of the way.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. And I've talked about this a lot in, in some of the things that, when I've been around teaching. Yeah, and I just had this conversation last week with a group of new chiefs. It was a wellness discussion, and peer support programs have really evolved in the last, particularly in the last 5 years, but the last 10 years, I would say, you know, there is a recognition that we need to educate everybody in the police organization, not, from the newest officer all the way up to the chief and into our retirees about what PTS is, what PTSD is, what some of the negative coping mechanisms are, you know,
Right.
be able to pick up on these signs for, someone when somebody's, struggling and in distress, because outside of probably heart disease, suicide is the number one killer of police officers,
Right.
more than gun assaults.
Right.
um, and I would say that we probably haven't done a good job of equipping our supervisors with the right tools to be able to recognize, hey, here's someone that's just, you know, making some bad decisions because maybe they're a little negligent, versus here's somebody that's making bad decisions because they're involved in unhealthy coping mechanisms,
Right.
and they're, the train is coming off the tracks. And and lastly on that, this is the question that I put, because even I'll admittedly, as a chief, over the course of 10 years, I've dealt with multiple disciplinary issues,
Sure.
and a lot of them, if you can trace them back, is to likely unhealthy coping mechanisms. The difference is if you have frontline supervisors that can recognize and intervene at the right time, and then you can steer people into the resources, you can turn a career around. But if we don't know, and you don't recognize, or you choose to ignore, then the one mistake that an officer makes could be the last mistake, right? It could be the only mistake, and then termination might be the only outcome that's gonna be possible, rather than, hey, let's get somebody into, I'll just even say, like a treatment program, like an on-site residential treatment program. 10
Right.
years ago, no one was talking about that. Now, I think, thankfully, it's more common where an agency, if they have someone, let's just say, we'll use you as an example. If you've trained that lieutenant, given him the right resources, and then he has the right empathy and compassion and understanding of what the frontline officers are going through, you come to him and you tell him that, rather than being negligent and ignoring you and hoping that the problem goes away. He says, okay, have a seat. Have a seat, Dick. Let me make a phone call. And
Yeah.
now the choice is really out of your hands, because as a supervisor, it's now his responsibility. You've come to him. It's his responsibility to make sure that he gets you the help that you need. I'm not saying, and people listen to this might, and you touched on it. People might think that that's a way to escape accountability. It's not. That's just part of the accountability process,
Right.
right? I mean,
I think that if whether you're a peer or a leader of some, a supervisor of some sort, Pat, I mean, the time that I came up in law enforcement, when I began, again, that attitude that we had of suck it up, right? Get over it. That attitude has destroyed thousands of lives, right?
right.
And that attitude is the escape of accountability from a leader, right? You get these old school leaders and they look at you and say, well, you know what? Just suck it up. I lived through it. That's the escape of accountability. That's how I look at it, right? I mean, if you're going to stand up and say I'm a leader, and I have terms. So there's those leaders, there's supervisors, and there's people that I call dilettantes. They got no business being in any kind of, they attach themselves to somebody that was a shooting star. I talked about this yesterday on podcast, and and really, other than that, that was their talent, was to suck up. And whether we want to admit that those people exist or not, we know they do.
Oh
Right.
yeah, they're in every organization. Isn't that's not just policing, right?
Yeah,
That's
that's everywhere. I
that's
mean,
watch Survivor.
so, but that attitude, we have to get over that. I mean, the answer during my my first years of law enforcement, obviously my whole 17 years, was, cops that are having problems, fire 'em. That was the answer. It wasn't, hey, Dick Odom is a 17-year law enforcement veteran who is a highly skilled canine trainer who's been, I would say regionally known. I don't know about nationally. He trained several hundred dog teams. How is it that, in that time I had left the canine division, and I told Andy Hughes one day, we were talking about this. I said, Andy, the first time anybody ever heard me say I wanted out of the canine division, you should have sent me to the shrink right then. Off to the psychiatrist you go, because I didn't just change my life, Pat. I changed it drastically. Everybody knew me as the dog guy. If you wanted to train a dog, you call, hey, man, what are you doing? Can you help me? Right. I
Right.
mean, I was traveling, teaching seminars. I had people calling me, hey, can you come out here and teach this? So why is it that you could so easily dismiss that value and that experience, right? From a guy that didn't never display problems at work, right? I did my job. I always, because that was part of my ruse, right? That was part of keeping you away from knowing who Dirty Dick was. I went to work. I made sure I did my job to the T. I stayed active, right? Till they parked me behind a desk. It just knocked the wind out of every cell I had, right? So, why is it that I was so like, well, we're done with this. Let's throw him away and burn him. Now, I'm not the only cop that ever happened to, right? But let's what if this? What if somebody had come to me like you just mentioned and said, hey, well, you have a problem. We're going to put you in treatment. I tend to think that I'm a fairly bright person. I think I could have brought a lot to an agency, right? I crossed the line. I accept it. You can read it in my books, right? I mean, the title of the book says it. The Oathbreaker, the 99% outlaw. There's a theme, right? There's a
Right.
theme. The last book is titled "Don't Be a Dick." It'll be out in the fall, right? So there is a theme.
Very catchy.
Well, thank you. When you deal with the PTS, all these other things over time, it gets you a little unbalanced. Well, the good thing about being a little unbalanced is it unlocks creativity.
That it does. That it does. And cops are very creative people. They may not recognize it, but it's just kind of part of, I think it's just part of the process, even if they don't think so. When you're investigating cases and when you're working cases, you're forced to run multiple things through your head, always running scenarios to, what could have happened, what could have happened. Certainly you have to come back to what does the evidence say, but looking for that evidence, that's all part of the process. Not to go on a little tangent here, but
Right.
but I think that also I think it also kind of speaks to the type of people that go into law enforcement, generally very caring, very compassionate, uh, but also, kind of a type A personality, driven, uh, risk takers.
Yeah.
And
Let's
you,
talk about that for a second. Risk
yeah,
take.
well, yeah, because this is kind of where I want to go, but, where, and ultimately, it's kind of how we form our identity as cops.
Yes.
And I think maybe, and if we're thinking about like what led Dick to the point where he's going in to tell his lieutenant, I got a problem. Obviously it didn't start that day. It started a
No.
long time before that. And having the courage to go in and say something first and foremost is, that's very commendable, because most never say anything, and and again, one final time just to kind of touch on this, and it's the point that I made in that class last week is how often cops loathe to be critical of other cops. They just do.
Oh, yes, they
Yeah.
do.
Why? And you have to ask the question why. Well, because we all know that the mirror, that we're looking in a mirror, and that if we're critical of others, they can be equally critical of us because we've all made mistakes.
Right.
And it's a very difficult job. But ultimately, and I'll give you an example of this. And this was in my post career. I coach, I do different things. But I was having a conversation with the young supervisor, and he was upset because he got disciplined for something that happened that wasn't necessarily his responsibility. It was another supervisor's responsibility, but he was present when a policy violation occurred.
Hmm.
The mistake that he made was that he didn't do anything about it. He was aware of it and just assumed that the other supervisor would take care of it. The other supervisor didn't. They both wind up getting disciplined. So he was upset that he got disciplined and he was just trying to work through that. And in the end, there was a room full of people that all observed the same thing. And so I asked him, I was like, "Hey, let me ask you one question. There was a time when you were not a supervisor, where you were a fellow officer.
Right.
And he made a comment that the person who had the policy violation, it wasn't the first time, and he had observed this while he was also an officer. So my
Hmm.
question was, hey, when you saw that when you were an officer, what action did you take?
Uh-oh, accountability.
None. He didn't take any, right? And so he assumed and just he it's an easy way to deflect accountability. Well, the supervisor is responsible. That's not my job. That's his job. Well,
Hmm.
wrong. Right? Wrong. It's both of their responsibility, sure. And the supervisor is going to be held accountable. But, let's look at the Derek Chauvin case. Regardless of what you think about that case, in the end, multiple officers there, lost their, went to prison because of a failure to act, a failure to intervene. Policy now comes in. And, that's not, while people on the outside might think that that's something new and innovative that came as a result of that case, wrong
Hmm.
again. That's a policy that's been around and an expectation that's been around long before that. But it was just kind of one of those first times where the outside world called us out on it. Like, hey, you can't observe this kind of thing and then not intervene and then expect people not to be upset about it. And so as individuals, this is why cops loathe to be critical of other cops, is because at some point, we're concerned about that finger being pointed at us. And so it's easier, I think, to acquiesce in the moment. But
I,
yeah, I mean, it's a
Todd, I
complex,
think
it's a complex web.
I, in the 99% Outlaw, there's a story in there about a guy named Gary Brookman. Gary's a border patrol agent, or was, okay. And in the 2000s, he was arrested and charged for assaulting an immigrant and put in prison. And I sat at a conference of this so-called motorcycle club, listening to them judge his future as a brother of the club, right? Completely disgusted me the whole time. I wanted to throw up about the thing, right? What happened to Gary could have happened to any one of us. Now, Gary, when I interviewed him for the first book, he said, listen, the day I got convicted in federal court, I went and stood on top of a bridge ready to jump off of it in Texas, right? Nobody was there around him. I feel like talking to Gary was simply the grace of God kept him alive, right? Years later, Donald Trump, our president, would pardon him. Now, every person that sat in there and said, well, he's a convicted felon, we need to throw him out of here. My question is, like, we would talk about being critical, right? We don't
Right.
want to be, right? I don't want to be critical of another cop in that sense. in that situation, I'm going to be. I'm going to say, hey, this guy was out there doing his job. And if you read the evidence in the case and had people done that, they would have seen he was getting set up. It was pretty obvious by this federal prosecutor, right? I mean, it was the guy brought in a convicted drug dealer that Gary had arrested and had imprisoned and used him to testify against him. And then this guy disappeared, right? So accountability's gone.
Yeah.
And Gary spends years in federal prison. And now the people in his support system that he thought was around him is, except for a portion of them, okay? Some of these men stood next to him as they said they would. But I can only imagine now how many people were visiting Gary or calling him. I didn't. You know why? I didn't want to think about being in prison because just what I said, it could have happened to any of us, right? And when he got pardoned by President Trump and was completely absolved of all of that, it was like, I'm sure it was a great thing for him, you know, and I know it was talking to him, but that doesn't take back the years of his life, right? You're
Right.
not getting that back. That's gone.
Yeah, and
So
the same goes for, people that are wrongfully convicted of crimes because cops are too lazy to do their job, right? And
yeah, Pat,
yeah.
and I'm telling you, my eyes are changing. I talk to Dr. Olivia Johnson probably a couple times a week through other things, and I learning more about her research. And I'm going to tell you, she's working on a thing called Wolves Behind the Badge. And I'm gonna tell you, Pat, she's got tons of research that make me feel like, my God, what was I protecting? Why would I ever help somebody? Or, I mean, she has got number after number that, there's more and more law enforcement that they're coming into this profession as criminals,
Oh man. I
pedophiles. It is just getting worse. And so she and I just had this conversation. I said, during my time, I think that was less predominant, right? It was much harder to get into law enforcement when I became a cop. I mean, you literally had to work to get a job in law enforcement, Now, I mean, the status of recruitment is so bad. I mean, I did the 3 motorcycle accidents. My last one, I was left with a compressed fracture in my spine, and I never had any medical treatment, nothing, right? There's no way I'm physically able to do that job. But our law enforcement is such a sad state that I promise you, if I put a resume out today, I'd have 15 agencies calling me and probably offer me bonuses, right?
yeah.
Even though when I'm looking at them saying, I'm giving you this resume, but physically I cannot do this job, right? And so, you look back and I heard stories about cops when I was a cop, this guy retired and then he got called in by the sheriff's office. He blew his head off. Why? Well, because he was getting interviewed about molesting his grandchild. So, that kind of stuff, it's disturbing, right? I really have sat around and beat the crap out of myself for years about my alcoholism and about my addictions, addiction to hydrocodone, opioids, and infidelity. I mean, I have just torn myself up about that. And I'm not trying to make it any better, right? But I do sit back and look at what's coming out of law enforcement now, what's happening. And I think to myself, my God, why have you beat yourself up for 20 years? This doesn't make sense. You were nearly an angel compared to what's really there. I mean, just last week, there's a deputy in California, San Bernardino, I think.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you if yeah, because he's out your way, right? That was pretty crazy.
I don't know that guy. I got no idea who he was, but naturally having written, I believe, the only book about law enforcement motorcycle clubs, especially in the sense of crossing lines, right? I got notified like 3 or 4 by people I know, like, hey, have you seen this? So I started reading it. And the guy owned a gun store at one time. It went out of business. When they raided him, this explained over 160 weapons in his house. Maybe. Okay. Maybe. Then they find all kinds of Mongols paraphernalia, memorabilia, around the house, right? Was the guy actually a Mongol? No, I don't believe that. I mean, I don't believe if you go back and do your research, Mongols have security checks in place. If you go back and read Billy Queen's book, my gosh, Under and Alone, Billy, he's one of the very few, and I've not met this gentleman. I hope to one day. He's one of the very few men that infiltrated the Mongols outlaw or Mongols motorcycle club, became a full patch member, right? Well, there are specific stories in that book where Billy tells you as he's going in how he gets challenged. I mean, there's one day he's out shooting guns with these guys, and this one guy, I believe is my memory is correct, they called him Red Dog. He was a sergeant in arms for this charter. I mean, they got this guy out there shooting guns, and he looks at him while he's pointing a gun down range. Billy's walking down to put a bottle up or whatever, and the guy points a gun at me. He says, "Hey, when'd you go to police academy?" Well, now listen, if you're not trained, I know jack squat about undercover work, okay? But what I do know is your brain. If you have not trained yourself to be that person, right? He could have easily turned around and said, "I went to police academy in 1986." And then bam, and he shot him dead, right? So the likelihood of this guy, them not know, because there was some word on social media, they were trying to say, well, Mongols, he was not part of the Mongols and blah, blah, blah. They didn't know he was a cop. Okay, no, I'm not buying any of that, right? I mean, if an outlaw motorcycle club is letting a cop hang around, they know it. They know exactly who that person is. They know what that person does. So, you know, it's these kinds of things, Pat, that I'm seeing more and more. And yeah, it just kind of makes me sick to my stomach now. I hate to say that, but you know, that's
Yeah,
where
yeah, I've talked about this a lot on, in previous episodes, and I call it manifest destiny. And in the post-Ferguson days, that's really when we started to see an accelerate. We had already started to see a decline in the number of applicants coming into policing as far back as 2012, 13, 14. But then in the post-Ferguson days, it just a precipitous drop in the number of people looking to come into the profession. And that's when we first started to hear about conversations around depolicing and
yeah,
and a lot of people like try to dispute it. And when you're looking for, academic research, it may be something that's hard to prove from from an academic perspective, but for those of us that were inside policing, it was really easy to see. I mean, this wasn't a shock.
yeah,
With that being said, the problem is, and just all this confluence of events that are occurring, population in the age group that's eligible to become police officers is declining. The prestige and the image and the nobility of policing is tarnished. People stop coming into the profession, and now you're in this case where the calls for service keep coming in, the demand for services aren't going away, and agencies are running short, and that's putting pressure on agencies in a lot of different ways. It's forcing them to do more with less. And where does that all fall at the feet of the officers on the street that have to go out there and do the job? And again, just to touch on kind of the conversation that I had last week with these new chiefs is, listen, the reason we started to look, and this is just being candid, I wish I could say that it was out of the kindness and the goodness of our hearts that this press into police wellness, um, a lot of it was forced on us because the model 15 years ago, just like you said earlier, oh, Dick's got an alcohol problem, fire him, bring in the
fire,
next guy, next man up,
yeah,
and next officer up. Now we're in this situation. Well, all right, we can fire him, but that's just gonna put us one more down. And so now we're almost forced to say and to recognize, look, maybe we're not approaching this the right way. Maybe the reason why our poor performance is because we're missing an element in how we train and prepare and equip our officers. It's not just about the tactical and the technical knowledge and the equipment. It's also, and this is kind of really the passion that drives me behind Coptimizer, is it's the individual that drives everything that we're investing. And if we're not optimizing the person, then in the end, we're going to fail at higher rates than if we optimize the person. So we kind of got forced into this as a profession. And sadly, the public has also been forced to reconcile some of these beliefs that are false about policing with the understanding that we have to invest. Like the de-investment is the defund, which is de-investment, is
Right.
if you think about it, right? The logic, hey, we're not satisfied with the policing profession as a whole. We think it has problems. We need to improve it. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut funding.
Right. That makes perfect sense, right?
Yeah, we're going to cut funding.
I it's nuts. The other day, not long ago, I was watching a video of it was a patrol officer somewhere. He was in Baltimore, and he keyed up his he took a audio of his car radio. Any officer, and they were doing this citywide transmission, begging the cops that were on the street to stay at work, right? Because they're
Right.
so short-handed, they can't cover any shift with full staff. And then their mayor there is going, he wants to defund the police. And so, that trickle down effect from the top is going to get all the way to the bottom. And now, right, I mean, if you go in, now, yeah, somebody's an alcoholic, they're more prone to get treatment now because of that situation, Pat.
It's true.
Those situations, right? And I think it's very sad because I saw in my 17 years, I mean, my gosh, if you put a pencil to the money that was put into me, okay, my education as a canine trainer, I taught a couple other schools and classes for our agency. If you put a pencil to it, the waste of money that got shot down the drain because nobody wanted to try, right? It was just like, well, we'll fire him, right? Just get rid of him. But I saw in my 17 years, I probably saw at least a dozen cops that happened to. I saw it once a year, you
Yeah.
know, and it was like some of these guys, I agree, some of them did not need to be in law enforcement, right? Because they came in and it was like within 6 months they were alcoholics. We're
Right.
kind of we came in with this problem. We just hid it for 6 months and we didn't improve it, right? Um, but then there was some, they just simply snapped. They started drinking, it got out of control. And again, rather than somebody going and helping them, it was wait till they screw up and fire them. And for those guys, it was different than but in that sense. But I still have to question, why are we taking so long? We're supposed to be the smart ones on the scene, right?
You're supposed to
Why are
be.
we taking so long to figure out this jigsaw puzzle with our brain? We go and we train to shoot. We train to run and shoot. We train to drive cars and crap that nobody should be doing. But in 17 years of my law enforcement career, I cannot recall one time that I was sat down and talked to about my mental wellness.
Yeah. And that's because it didn't happen and we didn't do it. And now
Right.
I'm not saying that some agencies didn't do it. And look, this is a very complex issue. So I don't want to sound, I don't want us to, or people listening to think that we're just oversimplifying,
No.
because we are making some generalizations here, but
Right.
I do think that uh, there is really a lesson. The lesson here is a long time ago, we should have realized that there are better ways to address
Sure.
poor coping mechanisms. And just like what you said, the best way to address it is to prevent it. Well, how do you prevent it? Well, you educate and you train and you
Yeah.
invest in your people. And there's a lot of ways that we can do that. you use a great example there. Um, I've presented with Dr. Gilmartin before on our Blood Doesn't Lie program, and that's really about testing someone's blood just to see if they have some predictive indicators of cardiovascular disease, the number one killer of cops. But it's also very predictive and prescriptive of stress in the body,
Right.
inflammation, insulin resistance, these things. It's a look downstream about where you're heading. I mean, you're in the canoe and you're floating down the river. Like,
Right.
are you paddling or and you steering, or
Are we
are you?
steering or are we just floating or recklessly, right?
Yes,
Down the, no, I
exactly.
get that. Those are the things, Pat, and let's be specific now for the listeners here, okay?
Okay.
I left law enforcement in 2006. This did not happen yesterday, right?
Right.
So
Absolutely.
when I speak, I'm speaking from 2006 back 17 years, okay?
Yep.
Or so I want them to know that, right? I don't want to I can speak on things that I've read about and maybe validated in some way now, but I can't speak from a personal experience of law enforcement as it stands right now at this second today, and how the officers are handling or being given mental wellness treatment. Maybe it is completely better. I mean, I hope and pray that it is. I suspect there's just as many agencies that are lacking it that as there are that have it, right? So yeah,
We're trying to change that. We are definitely trying to
yeah.
change that. But I do I do believe that it has gotten better. And we are now. I think there are a lot of agencies that have come at this, a lot of young new leaders that have recognized this problem inside their organizations, and they're now in a position to be able to affect positive change, and they're doing that.
Hmm.
They're taking work that was started and they're carrying it on. And I think there's others that have been kind of, you know, forced into it. Regardless, the more momentum we can build, the more that we can educate our leaders and our young supervisors that are coming up about resources that are available, these tripwires that do exist. How do we recognize it? Yeah. And you bring up a great point, because I want to talk about your case in specific.
Hmm.
When you talk about um, educating the future, a lot of the mistakes that we make in policing, we think that they're new, they're novel. And when you're a young officer, right, you think like, I've got this shit figured out. Like, come on.
Yeah.
Like, what do these old timers know? They don't know anything. And it's like, I used to joke, like, every year I got older, like, especially after I had kids, right, that my own parents seemed to be smarter and smarter. I was like, wow, maybe they did know a little bit more. And it's kind
Right.
of like that with veteran officers. You don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And even when they tell you to your face, sometimes you just refuse to believe it. Like, I've got this. And then you realize, okay, well, there was a reason, right? We have policy manuals this thick for a reason. Uh, and so I kind of want to go back in no, first and foremost, what is a 99% outlaw? Because we've mentioned that a few times. People may not know what it is if they haven't read your book.
Oh, a 99% outlaw. This is a person that they ride a motorcycle, right? They're in a club of some kind, generally. Maybe not, but generally they will be. This is a person that lives in the gray area of our world. We dance between the law and no law, right? That's the person that, and honestly, and I believe I said this in my first book, Pat, you get a mindset that you're above the law, right? Now, why is that? Because you were in a law enforcement motorcycle club, right? I got a badge and I got all this. So you skirt that gray area and you seriously test every relationship that you have, whether it be familial, an acquaintance, makes no difference. You're going to put these people under strain by your actions, right? These are people that are wanting to live the 1% lifestyle, which is how an outlaw motorcycle club member lives, right? They don't believe in the rule of law.
So that is your Hell's Angel, your Mongol,
That's an
your
outlaw
outlaw.
motorcycle, right?
Right.
When we talk about that, you've got the what's called the Big Five in the outlaw motorcycle club world. Um, there's Hell's Angels, Banditos, Mongols, outlaws, and the pagans, right? These
Right.
are your big five. Now you have tons of supporter clubs, right? There's smaller clubs that operate on the edge of these clubs. These are the clubs that will often do the work for the mother club, right? These are risk takers. They're trying to graduate in some sense, and some of them aren't. But they wear this nice little diamond on their vest, and it says 1% in it. 1%, many, many years ago in Hollister, the first, as this came out, there was a story. Bunch of motorcyclists that had returned from World War II. They all got together and they started riding. And in Hollister, there's this big event, and they completely destroyed Hollister, California this time, right? So the American, at that time, motorcycling was very, I think, new, and people enjoyed it because it gave you the feeling of being free spirited. So after Hollister, this town it got destroyed. American Motorcycle Association comes out and says, listen, only 1% of motorcyclists are unruly, right? This is the story. Now, there's also the American Motorcycle Association coming out saying we never said that, but who cares because it's stuck, right?
Right.
Now we have the 1%ers, and the 1%ers are exactly that. They say we live on the edge of society. We care nothing for your rules. We're gonna sell women, sell drugs, sell guns, do whatever we want to do, right? That's where that mindset developed. 99% outlaws take a bit of that and really ride it hard, right? Really put it to the test. Unfortunately, even when I was writing the 99% outlaw, there's story after story. Lloyd McElhaney, Mac, he's a great guy down in Broward County. He worked undercover in the Mystic Seven, which was a supporter club for the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. And he's just got this wonderful story. And so Mac didn't fall prey to that world. But now let's go across the country to Arizona, and you're going to find a story in the book about a guy named Jack Hudson. Jack worked on an undercover task force, narcotics task force, and he was working outlaw motorcycle club. What happened? This deputy went completely 1% outlaw, and he killed two of his fellow undercover narcotics officers while he was robbing narcotics and weapons and cash out of the evidence vault. He went there to rob it, right? So,
Right.
now, Pat, these are extreme definitions, right? I mean,
Right.
these aren't really 99% outlaws now. These guys have kind of crossed the line. They just happen to have a badge on the other side, right?
Yeah. The 1% of the
99%
1%.
outlaws, say it again.
The 1% of the 1%.
Yeah, that would be, yeah, I guess that would
Probably
be
even small, probably even smaller than that. But those are,
there's
of course, that's
very,
going to get all the attention.
oh yeah. I mean, when I was doing the interviews for the book, I was talking to Jay Dobbins. Jay's a retired ATF agent, and he's written a couple books. I certainly his No Angel is a great book.
Yeah.
But Jay said that he had met Jack. He'd actually done some training for him, and I thought, and I didn't know that when I was writing the book. Right, this came out after I interviewed Jay, and he was going back through like every time I interview somebody, I allow them to read the book before I publish it. Right, that's just part of my process. I want you to know exactly word for word what's
Right.
in there. And
Well,
Jay,
and that, which is nice, especially for people that have worked in that world, right? That's
yeah. Now remember, my life was I didn't work undercover. Right, this was a persona that I went from Deputy of the Year 1997 to I think it was 2000. I'm going to get into motorcycling, and I bought my first Harley. And
all right. This is where I wanted to go.
okay,
I've been waiting to get to this point. So,
yeah, it started out really fun for about a year, maybe a year and a half, two, and then it just, man, you go from zero to what the hell just happened, you know? I mean, it's, I'd love to sit here and say the trauma from law enforcement caused all that, but I can't, Pat. I can't say that it was anything in law enforcement that caused me to act that way. I mean, yeah, my childhood, and it's in the first book. I'll give you, for instance, in elementary school, I was not a good student. I never have been, and I've learned now I have ADHD. Brother, I'm fixing to be 53 years old. Okay. To learn at 50, when I was writing my first book, to finally go, oh crap. It's like, I so could have had this, right? But it answered a lot of questions for me. But my childhood trauma had a lot to do with who I was coming out of high school. Right. And I mean, I went from high school to policing in the army and then police and civilian, just bam, bam, bam.
Yeah, I'm not a psychologist, but I can tell like you can kind of see like and this is where tribalism comes in, right? And there's this innate need for humans to feel connected to something and
Yeah.
somebody and groups, right? And in law enforcement, called the brotherhood, the sisterhood, right? It's one of the big allures. And I'll come back to it, but we have this saying like the thin blue line in policing, right? Uh, yeah.
Let me tell you something. You want to be my brother? You be my brother in Christ, and I'll love you all day. Right.
Right.
If you want to come to me with this thin blue line, moral dilemma, put that crap on your bumper sticker, go down the road. I got no care for it, right? I don't believe in it anymore. I mean, when you got people, they stand up and go, the thin blue line, it means X, Y, and Z. Well, let them butts get in trouble and three of them standing around, see what happens. The thin blue line dissipates into self-preservation every day of the week, right? So, and I got no care for it. I mean, it's a
I'm not
purpose.
laughing at you. I'm laughing with you
Oh,
because this is so fascinating. And here's the thing, right? It's you mentioned it earlier, that 99%, it's a gray area. And so I want to go back and I just want to I'm just trying to understand because listen, it doesn't matter where you are in the country. There are a lot of clubs that have
oh,
law enforcement officers. And listen, for people listening, there's nothing wrong with that, right? I don't want anyone to feel like, hey, if a cop is riding a motorcycle, they're probably prone to criminal behavior. No, not true,
no,
not true at
that's
all.
not true.
We had a group at my agency, that those guys, just solid human beings. One of the best people that I've ever known. Sadly we lost him to a heart attack, but he loved to ride, and it was. But to me, and here's the question I have for you, because where I where I got concerned is when I started to see some of them now wearing the leather vest, and now they're getting tattoos. Nothing wrong with tattoos. And it was just kind of like, that's interesting. It's interesting because you can put on a uniform and you can go out and you can stand for everything that's supposed to be right, but then
Right,
when you're off duty, that's kind of like these mixed messages. Like what
right.
I'm like, what's going on in the mind of somebody that's just kind of skirting those edges, and what's the allure? Like there's
Oh, the
something that's
allure.
drawing.
Well, when you're an alcoholic, the allure is strong, right? You bar hop, right? And you live in that world, and you adapt it, and you just, the allure of it is I'm not a cop for a minute, I think, right? I'm
Right.
acting like a real jackass and I like it. I don't know how else to say it, Pat. I mean,
It's like taking off the moral chains, right? Like you feel
it
like, hey, I'm
is,
free for just, maybe it's like you get on the bike and you're free.
yeah.
Um, Listen,
It's, but
I
it, the problem, then what I learned through that, right, is And in the 99% Outlaw, I talk about this. Everybody in the book is called Bob, Tom, or Harry for a particular reason. Okay.
Yeah, because
Some of these
they're
people
all in the CIA, right?
are only one man was in the CIA.
I did read that too. That was a fast. I didn't know that, by the way, and I was very familiar with that case. So
About Scott Robertson.
yeah, I didn't know that he was
Scott was, I'm
a
going to tell
police
you,
officer.
the first time I met that guy, I said, I love you. I don't, all right. I mean, he's just a guy that, and this was a long time ago. He's just a guy who was very personable. Now, I do not know why he looked after me the way he did in the end, right? But he was always, Scott cared about people, right? And Scott was not a 99% outlaw by any definition of that word. Matter of fact, if somebody stood in front of me and called him that, I'd probably be willing to take a charge for it, right? I mean, the guy was one of the most honorable men that you could ever want to meet in your life.
And
He made,
and for those who are not listening, you have to read the book, but just a quick backstory. He was killed in Afghanistan in 2009 when a uh, was Al Bawiri, I think is his name.
I can't, Alba, I can't
Yeah,
say it, but yes,
when
that's
he
very close,
detonated a suicide vest and killed, I believe it was 7 CIA officers.
right?
Yeah, pretty tragic. But yeah, that case in and of itself is pretty interesting. But I
No,
didn't know that his backstory in law enforcement. So that was interesting for me to
he
learn
was
that.
a, he worked, he was a cop in Atlanta. And that's
Yeah.
how it was the motorcycle club that we got connected through, right? That's how I met him. And we
Right.
had kind of a natural friendship. With Scott was he was very easy to like. You know, he was never assuming or judgmental. If he saw something going on that he knew wasn't right, you could see almost, I mean, I know this now, like he made a split second decision. Do I need to intervene in this or walk away? And that's what happened. Right.
Right.
Um, but no, as far as the names, you know, I mean, the reality of it is, Pat, some of those guys are still cops. And I got no intention of hurting anybody. My writing is for me. I mean, the best therapy I've had in my entire life has been the last year writing those two books.
Well,
Right.
and I'm glad you have, because these are really important conversations for people to listen to, particularly young officers. And one of the notes that I have in here that I write is discuss the influence that supervisors have in setting the tone for law enforcement, and why in today's law enforcement world filled with young supervisors, why we might see a regression rather than an improvement in the profession if we don't teach the lessons that you have written about in your book. And for those that maybe aren't in law enforcement, what has occurred in this massive shift in policing in the last decade is everyone that, not everyone, but a high percentage of people that are eligible for retirement in a period that, that came into policing under the cops grants in the 90s that really expanded policing, they're all retiring and going away. And more people are leaving the profession sooner, even before retirement age. So what that has left us with is these huge recruitment efforts to hire more cops, which is, again, we alluded to earlier, we're having difficulty finding the people that can meet the standards. So sadly, some agencies are lowering standards. They're cutting corners. They're hiring people today that
Yeah.
they wouldn't have hired 10 years ago. Fact. It's just true. And, and when you hire the wrong person, you may not know it in 3, 6, 9 months or a year. It's generally 5 to 7 years down the road where those character traits that are embedded in those people truly manifest themselves in ways that are going to embarrass policing. So
Right.
yeah, we have very young police departments, and which means young field training officers, which means young supervisors. So, it's not, I don't like to say the blind leading the blind, because that's not,
Well, but Pat,
that's
there is
fair.
a lot to say for experience, wisdom gained through experience, right?
Correct. Absolutely.
You cannot, I'm going to tell you one of the funniest things I ever saw. When I was in the military, you know, for a couple of years, and I got discharged, right? Um, honorably. Let me say that. That's always a question. Were you honorably discharged? Yes, I was. But I saw a few young lieutenants come into our company at this time. We had 2 or 3 platoons. Like the lieutenants got promoted, off they go, and then these brand new second lieutenants showed up. And so you have a noticeable difference, right? Even from a second lieutenant to a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army, the difference in the experience was huge. I mean, these new lieutenants come in and they're having just basic command issues that they can't figure out. And it's just a lack of experience. It's not that they don't have the drive or the focus, they just didn't have the answer, whatever it was, right? And I saw that going into law enforcement. I remember I went to work in the sheriff's office in '95, and I had been, so now I've been a cop for what, 4 or 5 years, about 4 years, right, at this time. And I get assigned to night shift. I'm there for like 6 months, and I work investigations with a guy for 6 months in that unit, and then they reassign me to patrol. And one night I'm on duty, and this guy, he's been a cop for all of like 9 months out of the academy. And he calls me and he says, "Hey, can you meet me?" Oh, and I said, "Sure, I can." Well, that county's 520 square miles, and there was at the most 3 of us working at night, right?
Right.
So I meet him, and he begins to explain to me the pecking order. And I listened to him, and I said, "So let me get this straight. You've been a cop all of 8 months, but you've been here 6 months longer than me, right? Or whatever it was. And you've decided that gives you some type of upper hand to tell me how to handle calls," because that's what he was getting after. And he says, "Well, yeah." And I said, "Well, that's never going to happen, right? I am never going to stand around and look at you and tell you to make a decision." I said, "You barely even," I said, "Could you even write a traffic accident report up?" "Well, we don't do those here." I said, "This is my point." How could you possibly want to or think that you can be a leader of any sense when you don't even have knowledge of paperwork, right? So, this was, like I said, '95, but now with the recruiting problem, and I much prefer to hear recruiting now than what I used to hear. You go into a convenience store and you see a guy, you can tell he's no more than 22, 23 years old, and he got sergeant stripes on. And look, I'm looking at him going, maybe he's really, really smart.
Yeah.
I want to knock these people that are working for that job, right? But
Right.
I think you got to come in. Let's use some mafioso words here. We're going to have some consiglieres, right? We're going to have some counselors come in to help these people. There's got to be more, and it just can't be leadership training, Pat. It's got to be a constant daily voice of peer counseling for leaders. Would it kill an agency to start a program with retirees? I don't think so. I mean, to be able to bring Pat back into the agency one night a month and just talk, just listen, or say, "Hey, Pat, while you're doing something, would you mind?" Right? I mean, there's so many things that they can do, but when we get so overwhelmed, we're not utilizing our natural resources, right?
Yeah,
You
it's a
got,
brain drain for sure. There's been a brain
yeah,
drain. Experience, maybe brain's not the right word, but experience drain for sure. Um, yeah, and that kind of leads into a whole nother conversation too, because it's interesting when when you do retire and you step away. Um, it does take you a while to gain your footing in the civilian world when like for me, it was 4 years military police before I went to college, and then 27 years of policing and 10 years as a chief, right? And when you're a chief, despite all your best efforts, you definitely get removed from the street. You're not, it doesn't mean that you don't understand and don't know what's going on, because you're reading, you're talking. I mean, if your supervisors are doing a good job, which I had a great staff, right? So, I always felt like I knew what I needed to know. Sure, every once in a while you're going to miss something, but
sure.
uh, you know, that's, but it's the nature of the task. and the responsibilities that you have, depending on where you're working. Uh, a chief is 100% administrative, right? You're not, I mean, in smaller agencies, it's a little different. But you're not operational like that. So you, it takes a little bit of time to kind of to get your footing and to gain some, some perspective about, hey, what's life like post law enforcement? And then, really, then you kind of look like, all right, what am I going to do? Or how can I give back? Those types of questions. But yeah, what you're talking about, I think, is a mentoring program. I'm a big believer in what performance protocol is doing from actually, agencies hiring professional coaches, not just, and these coaches that have experience in policing, not just, a mentor or someone that, say, hey, this is what I did back in my day. It's
Right, right.
actually, there's
Pat,
the
while you're
science
talking
behind
about,
coaching.
yeah, and I think that things that I really, there's to me, and I'm going to try to say this correctly. There's a difference between dwelling and being introspective, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
I think that when a person gets to the point that they can be, my last year has been it's been all introspective for me, right? Writing down every dadgum mistake I ever made, dealing with it in some way, right? Not dwelling on it, but learning from it. And when you get to that point where you can be critical of yourself in a positive way, right? Okay, this is the mistake I made. Then come up with this is the solution for it, right? And I pretty much have done that all year, right? And I'm very proud to be able to say, yeah, okay, I was an alcoholic. I'm still an alcoholic. That's never going to change. I mean, for the love of God, I can tell you right now, when you crack open and twist off the top on a long neck Bud Light, the little vapor that comes out of the top, wow. I mean, I can smell it, right? But being introspective, I have learned stay away from that, dummy. Right? I was like, okay, this is not a thing I need to be into. And to be able to say, look at you and say, yes, I was an alcoholic. I was addicted to opioids, not to the extent that you saw like on television, but it hindered me.
right.
I was having so much back pain. I was taking 2, 3, 4 a day. And then before I knew it, I snorted a couple. And then before I know it, I got some guy locally that's a biker. He hands me a little bag of pills, and I'm like, okay. And you really just trash yourself, right? Now, for me to be introspective and take that, here's the difference between somebody that something happened to and a teacher. Can I take those incidents that I put myself through, put my family through, my peers through, and turn them into something that's teachable so that young Pat, when he comes to me and says, hey, Dick, I'm having this problem, and whatever it may be, if I've been through it, address it, but not in a way of being negative, saying, here's the mistakes I made. Here's the solution I got, and let's help you get one too, right? That's what we're going to be missing with young leadership, I'm afraid of, right? But those things, to be introspective to me is everything, right? That opens the door. I wrote a poem about a month ago called The Keys to the Armory. And that poem is solely based on a Christian's trip to finding their armor from our Lord, right? That's what it's about. It's about your trials and your tribulations and why did it take me this many years to get here, right? But can I convert all that into teachable things to be a mentor? Those are the mentors, right? That and just because somebody's never said anything doesn't mean they don't have the ability to do that, right? And maybe somebody sits with this veteran that has all these experiences but doesn't know how to get it out, and you help them. Just the other day, I was talking to a presenter, and they said, "I really want to write a book," and this person has these wonderful stories. And he said, "I don't know how to do it." Okay, well, the first thing, let's start with an outline. And they went, "Well, I never thought of that." Okay, well, this is our roadmap, right? This is how we
Right.
get to the end of the journey. So now her name is Jen Spears. She's a part of Thin Blue Connect. She's a great lady. She's a investigator for FDLE. She's done really awesome work on cold cases, right? So she already presents and teaches and does a wonderful job. But man, if she could write a book, that you could read, right? So I look at it this way. What have I learned that I can help her? Well, here's how we write a book. We can do that the same with mentors through leadership programs too, right? And the
Right.
other thing too, look at the pay that the officers are getting now. I mean, my gosh.
Oh yeah, it's definitely gotten a
I
lot better. And that's
do
one of the benefits for, again, here's another pressure that you have to use in a positive way. You leverage this opportunity to get the pay and benefits to a place where it should have been all along. Um, yeah, it's gonna, I think there's always opportunities for improving the profession, and you know, never let a good crisis go to waste, right?
exactly. I mean, 1992, I got an Army. I go to the police academy. I get my first job in Brundage, Alabama, making $6.24 an hour, right? And I was happy. Yeah, I was like, man, I'm a cop. So, now I think that the problem now, and certainly for me and owning a business, right, it's learning financial management, right? A lot of cops are just not good at that. Now you've got some that are great at it. You got some that are okay at it, and then you got a lot. You know who these lots are. They work overtime constantly, right? They're constantly. When I was a cop there in my last agency, I'd work a 12-hour shift, and then I would sign up for 4 hours of local impact time, right? So I was working 16 hours, and it was really because I had poor financial management skills. So when you can start bringing all of those, even those what we people think, oh, that's a small thing. It's really not. Your finances will drive you to do things that you didn't think you could do, right? Maybe work harder, or maybe buy a motorcycle when you shouldn't have, right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
uh, but those are the things I think that are needed, right? You got companies out there, performance protocol. Wow. See, companies are starting to get it. They're starting to go, it's not about a stack of applications anymore. We have to actively recruit great people and make them greater. That's the hope. Is it happening? I don't know. Right. You go and you look at like Travis Yates. Travis is big on recruitment, and he needs to be, right. I mean, he really does a good job at making you understand the difference in recruiting and a digital marketing campaign, and it's huge. You know, and I don't know that Travis is involved in any recruiting companies. That's none of my business. I just know that it's a point that he talks about because of the low numbers of law enforcement officers that we have to draw from now, and it's a very accurate and vital point.
Yeah, there's definitely a difference in in these. I think the rush and really kind of the desperation to try to bring in more recruits. I think agencies have kind of resorted to some of these, just kind of like fun videos to draw people in. And I think what's most important is when you're going to do something like that, you have to have some kind of system in place to understand if there is a return on investment, and
Right.
are the investments in these types of videos, are they actually driving the increase in the number of qualified candidates that you're bringing into the organization? Just having more applications doesn't necessarily equal success. It has to be
I,
qualified candidates that eventually can convert into a hire. And in order to do that, you have to have data, and you have to have, some kind of metric. And again, here's another opportunity that's been created because of this crisis, in that we are now being forced to look at our recruiting efforts. We have to professionalize those, just like there are other things that we need to professionalize in what we're doing. And yeah,
I,
oh man.
videos are videos, and they're great for promoting little things, but when you go and you look at numbers, Pat, and you start seeing agencies are paying $1 million for a video, I got to question everybody involved in that deal, right? And then you go do a little more research and find that video only actually produced like 3 applicants, and none of them were even qualified. I mean, now it's getting a little more egregious when that kind of stuff happens, but it's getting to be normal. I mean, it's like, well, we need more cops. Okay, I'll run a digital campaign for you with this video for $1.8 million for a month. Well, that's
Well,
$1.8 million that got wasted. You want to give me $1.8 million to recruit people for you? Call me. I will move to your city and get 100 cops somehow, right? I mean, that goes to work ethic problems in my mind, right? I've never been known to be lazy. I've worked very hard my whole life. And that's just people are finding ease of use to government money. And that's not okay. That's not cool, right? And when the government's let them do it, that's even worse. But that's affecting us, the cops on the street, right? I mean, it's having a direct effect. You 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 never know when you're gonna have a problem out there, So
well, so you also touched a minute ago on financial decisions. That's again, those are all, financial education is part of a comprehensive wellness program. So for agencies that don't think that, I mean, I would ask you to maybe reconsider those things because I can't, I knew this was going to happen. We're going to go really long, and I want to kind of tie things up, and we're gonna have to start planning for episode 2. But in 2008, I went through. I moved from working as a patrol supervisor into supervising a narcotics task force, and
Mhm.
the Bureau of Justice Assistance has had a great program at the time. I think it's still there, but they did frontline supervision for task force leaders. And so I went through this 3-day course, and what do they teach you when you're running a narcotics task force, or when you're working in a narcotics task force? The three things that you have to worry about the most, right? Cash, women, and drugs.
Right.
So it goes back to this this idea of the 99 percenter. And now so you take officers who go from this very rigid paramilitary structure where they're wearing uniforms, everything is, has a place and a reason.
Hmm.
Their appearance is scrutinized, and now you go into this undercover unit, and you get to grow beards, and you get to grow your hair long, and you start
Right.
creating these
You get an
personas.
earring and a new tattoo. Yeah, I've seen all that stuff.
Yeah, right. And then they kind of like, oh, look, those Harleys are kind of cool. If I rode a Harley, then and you can kind of see where, where that slippery slope exists.
Right.
And yeah, so going back into your story, what was the um, ultimately, so you saw these guys on motorcycles, like you just, hey, like, hey, I want to
No,
do that. What
no, I mean,
led you there?
there was a guy, and he and I were, we'll just call it friends. We hung out a lot. Our families hung out a lot. And I'd always wanted a motorcycle, a Harley. Years before I owned a little Honda, and finally I got to the place. I said, I can afford one, not an expensive one, so I bought one. Um, that bike is still mechanical today. That first bike was bought by Scott Robertson from me. Um, he came home from overseas on one of his tours, and he stopped by the house. He was coming from Atlanta down to his house in Florida, and he stopped by to visit. And I had bought my second motorcycle at the time, and he said, "Hey, I want to buy that bike." And I said, yeah. I mean, I put a lot of work myself in this bike, did most of it my own." And he's like, "Man, I really like that bike." Well, I love Scott to death. And I said, "I tell you what, I'll sell it to you for this." And he went, "What?" And I said, "If I'm gonna sell it to you, I'm not gonna. It's because I'm selling it to you because I love you, right?"
Right.
So we loaded the bike up in his truck. He took off, and there's a guy in Georgia owns that bike now. He bought it from Scott's widow, and that was my first bike. But that bike is what within 2-3 months of riding me. probably too much riding. My friend, he said he showed up with a bike one day, and I was like, okay, well, we started riding. Well, then we wanted to have a leather vest. So then it was time to decide, where we wanted to be. So we looked at clubs and then we made our decision. And that's how it started. In the beginning, it was very, we rode on Saturdays or when we were off, whatever days he and I were off, we worked shifts together. Then a couple more guys kind of started talking, and we got into that club, and it was all fun and games for about the first 2 years. And then, boy, the alcohol and the now when I talk about, don't think that uh, the infidelity started within the club too, right? I mean, before I knew it, I had a guy come to me saying, "Hey, Bob is sleeping with my wife." What? Uh, and so that really will just tear apart an environment of any kind, right? You got a lot of sedition going on. Then you start throwing in alcohol. Then you start throwing in some guy that decides he wants to be the president of that chapter. And now we're back to high school drama. Right. And it just tumbles out of control. I mean, I stood, and I talk about this in the book. I stood one night in a driveway at one of our parties with a cop out of Nashville sticking a Glock in my face. Just, he was drunk, decided he was whatever, I don't even know. And I'm going, and that's how it happens, right? You go from riding and having fun to next thing you know, everybody's freaking drinking. That person's wife is sleeping with that one, and that guy is sleeping with that one, and it just gets out of hand. And when you conceal it, for as long as you can till it explodes, there's just nobody looking. But yeah, it starts out all lovey-dovey and we're brothers and things like that. But the end
Yeah.
of it, that thin blue line that they talk about, and I love this statement, because I'll tell you quick, it don't mean crap to me. Never forget the brotherhood. That's a big one, right? They love to say that. They wear patches that says NFTB. Well, that's a bunch of horse crap. And we just talked about Gary Brugman. Did
Well,
he
any cop should know that, right? Because anyone that's ever worked the case, I mean, like that's the first thing that goes. Like, when you start talking prison time, loyalty goes right out the window. And that's also it's yeah, and again, the old adage that keeps popping into my mind as I listen and think back on this too, and kind of where you have these observations, right? Be mindful about who you surround yourself with. And I think a lot of agencies now do a really good job of educating young officers on ensuring that you maintain your relationships outside of the police department, the family, the friends, the networks,
Yeah.
and because it's not like you should never hang out with your fellow cops. You definitely should, but you have to have boundaries in all areas. And when
Yeah.
when you start talking about trauma and things that cops witness, we see a lot of things that most people just don't see.
They
And
don't
and
see it on
so
TV.
yeah, well, and even on TV doesn't tell the story, right?
Right.
And
Right.
it's and I'll tell you about a motorcycle crash that I went to once, which is there if there was ever a moment in my life where I thought someday I might get a motorcycle, that pretty much did me in. There was no chance.
I've
But
been through three and it would took the last
yeah,
one to learn. Right.
yeah, and I I just think it's not, Gordon Graham has this beautiful saying, right? If it's predictable, it's preventable. And these things, they're not sudden, they're not shocking, but if you get people that are seeing a lot of negative things, and then they get together, and then one drink leads to two, two leads to four, four leads to eight, and now
Right.
it can be a downward spiral. And if you don't have strong personalities or somebody there that is that kind call it a moral beacon, whatever you want, but someone that's gonna keep the trajectory going in the right way, right? Again, be careful about who you surround yourself with. It can go bad. And I think, most cops probably can tell you story after story. And ultimately, it really just Nietzsche's quote always comes to mind when I think about and have these kind of discussions, right? If
You
you
stare into
gaze,
the fist long enough.
yeah, the abyss also gazes into you, right?
Right.
He
Yeah.
who fights monsters, or fights with monsters should, be
Uh,
careful lest they therefore become a monster.
yeah.
And
That quote's actually my first book because I think it's such an appropriate quote.
right.
You
And
know.
so it's important for people like you to share these stories. And we're gonna have to have an episode too, but tell me, let's transition real quick because um I want to hear about what you're doing with Thin Blue Connect. And well, I know what you're doing, but I want you to tell the audience what you're doing and why you think it's important.
So Thin Blue Connect is it's a platform. It's an honor society, right? That's what it's titled at. It's at the base of it. It is. As I began to write my first book, I was looking around and I'm looking at, how do I promote my book? How to do this? How to do that? And I started watching everybody, and there was this really like it just seemed like there was so many people had these wonderful messages going in all the opposite directions, right? And so I thought, well, what if we could get these type of people on one platform so agencies could find them quicker, right? Um, it's an invitation only society. It's done that way by design, and I'll tell you exactly why. As I was researching, and again, I just talked about this yesterday. As I was researching my first book, I talked to psychologists and several people, and one person in particular who allegedly, deals with first responders. This person was talking to me, and they said, um, they're talking about a cop that had to use their sidearm and they had to take somebody's life. And this person started explaining to me how the cops don't have a problem killing anybody. Well, wait a minute now. I really like the phone call basically ended within a minute, right? I was
Right.
done. And my words were, this is not safe. Okay. Um, Police officers have to know compassion. I mean, if you don't have compassion, you're not going to be as effective as you need to be, and you're probably being kind of doing things you shouldn't be, right? But to hear somebody who's a licensed psychologist say this, it really just blew me back, Pat. I went, holy crap. Because now I never had to take anybody's life with my sidearm, right? Um, as a young police officer, civilian officer, I got into a pursuit and a young man died. He was on a motorcycle. And I look back at that and I think to myself how many times I should have never, it was a traffic violation, right? Um,
Right.
but I'm cognizant of that, okay? And I've learned compassion about all that stuff. Yes, it was a young man's fault that he passed away, and I'll forever regret that. And wading through the creek to find his body on the other side of the creek where he got thrown off his motorcycle. Probably, geez, the guy had been 200 yards, flying through the air. He was going over 100 miles an hour when he wrecked. Um, yeah, that scene will haunt me for the rest of my life, turning that young man's body over and seeing what had happened to his face, right? But I can learn from that. I can learn compassion from that, right? And I think that's kind of where that's got to go. So all of that, as I was writing, I thought there's got to be a better way. There has to be access to vetted presenters and authors that people can trust and say, yeah, we understand, we know this. They're not saying things that, whether you like what I just said or not, I don't really care. You didn't stand in front of me and tell me the cop got no problem killing somebody. Well, now we got problems, right? Because I just don't believe that's the mindset we should be living in. We're not soldiers. Now, society has turned us into warriors, right? Cops into warriors, unfortunately, but it's not what a law enforcement officer was designed for. So that started Thin Blue Connect, right? It was like, well, I'm going to build a platform. We're going to have high value messages coming out of there, right? So that's where it started. And, we went through a couple of transitions to kind of get to the model where we're at. And when you're building anything that resembles a business, It's not always going to fly and just go perfect, right? You're going to have bumps in the roads. And so through that, now we're doing, we're progressing into other things. We'll have, we've got great quality presenters on the website, right? There's John Kelly, Travis Yates, Andy Hughes, Jen Spears, Mark DeBona, Clee Tillman, Tim Rupp, Tom Rizzo, Tammy Featherstone. I mean, the list goes on, right? We've got great presenters in there. And I feel like for me, part of my give back, again, I'm going to go back to my titles of my books, The Oathbreaker and the 99% Outlaw. Those aren't noble titles at all. But this is how I give back to the profession, because when I die, Pat, I want people to look at me and remember me and say, you know what? He had his troubles, but the guy really tried in the end, and he helped a few people. And if I can help people that are like, you know, guys and ladies that are really working hard to get these messages out there to these first responders that need to hear them, I'm going to do that. And so in an effort to do that, I haven't got the dates nailed down, the end of July, beginning of August, somewhere in there. We're going to have our first seminar in Oregon, here in this little town of Eagle Point, right? We've got some pretty great people that's coming to that we've already put into that, and there'll be more. Then there's and I really can't talk about this too much because there is a huge conference coming next year that is going to revolutionize and change the way we train, treat, and lead our people. They're going to be, I mean, I'm working with, I can say this, Dr. Olivia Johnson and Dr. Jory Crotchins with the Blue Wall Institute to coordinate this thing, and it's going to be magnificent, Pat. So that's the effort, right, is to facilitate that, to have people that have these messages that aren't kooky, because you know as good as I do, there's a million fraudsters in this industry already.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to establish kind of a line there and say, no, we're going to do this professionally. That's how Thin Blue Connect started. And I think it's doing very well. We've got some high quality members that I'm so excited to be able to have in my life. I think for me, that's been the most amazing thing, is be able to talk to people, you know, and learn their stories too. But that's Thin Blue Connect. It's building, it's getting more. Hopefully, we will start having seminars. The seminars in the country there'll be like 2-3 day seminars. They'll kind of go around the country every couple of months is the hope. But these seminars are intended to highlight the presenters that will be at the big conference annually, right? So, and we've got a lot of other great things going into it. But Thin Blue Connect is my way of giving back, Pat. It's my way of 25 people in an organization, and me doing what I can, right, to help them pursue their passions, right? Have you got to speak to John Kelly very much?
No, but I do follow everyone that you just mentioned, and yeah, it's pretty humbling, and I do appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it. And
Good work stands out, Pat. Right? When people
well,
are doing good work, people are going to notice it, and that's
I just really appreciate you sharing your story and your message, because like we touched on, there is a need to pass on this experience and this wisdom and this knowledge. So it's Thin Blue Connect is the website, correct?
thinblueconnect.com, right? You can go there.
Can we buy your books there on Thin Blue
Uh,
Connect?
you can hit there's a mission statement page, and there's a picture of a book. You can click there, or you can go to Amazon.
Okay.
Both of my books are on Amazon for sale. The last book, it'll be on Amazon, I imagine. Of course, it won't be out to the fall. I'm very excited about that book, like more so than the first two.
Well,
Um,
I really like 99% Outlaw, and for
Thank you.
it, for young officers, I just think, well, anyone, right? There's just uh I just love supporting police officers that are authors, right? I try to get as many authors as I can on the show because
Right.
there's something I'm a reader. And I just love to share stories. And
Yeah.
a friend of mine has told me like my superpower is that I'm a human connector. Like I connect people.
Right.
And so anytime I'm reading stories, and just learning about, and again, I'm like, there's always something everybody is a teacher, whether they know it or not. And we can learn things, we can avoid a lot of mistakes by learning from what others have done. We can learn from mistakes, we can learn from the mistakes of others,
Right.
but but you have to take the time to invest, and it does take people like you that are spending their valuable time to make the effort to connect people and to help them learn these lessons. So I definitely appreciate you doing that.
Well, thank you. I enjoy writing. I mean, it's I've never been a poet, and my poetry is probably horrible, but I enjoy writing poetry too, right? It's I think
It's becoming a lost art. It's people
we
don't
talked
write.
about earlier about how cops were creative. You know, they were
Right.
generally, a lot of them are very creative. And I mean, over the years, I saw guys, they were great. Maybe they were great carpenters, right? And almost to the point, it wasn't art the way they did it, right? Maybe they were really great mechanics or car builders or are musicians. And until you get to know them personally, you just don't know that about them. You know, for me, it ended up being like my life made sense finally a year ago, right? I said, Andy Hughes and I were talking one day. I said, my life wasn't shitty. It was training for who I am now, right? Not all purposes in life are going to be noble. Yeah, I made my share of mistakes. Let's talk about them. And those young cops out there, when they say, I'm going to go buy a Harley, I'm going to join this club and get me a 3-piece patch. Well, listen, kids, you're walking into a world. I got cornered up more than once, places I really didn't need to be, nearly getting ready to get my butt kicked. I mean, there's a couple of situations in the 99% outline I talk about where there was no doubt, had a couple guys from my club not walked in, there was one I was supposed to take a beating of a life, right? So maybe if I would have read a book like that 20 years ago, maybe I could have avoided those. So I'm going to continue to write, and I've got, wow. I mean, this last book, it's about tangible solutions. It's not a book you're going to read in the end. It's going to say, go find a therapist. It's going to be a book that you're going to walk away from. Like, I'm big on Pavlovian conditioning. Um, and this is rooted from my training police dogs, right? I finally realized if I can train a dog to go find one of any odor that I want to train it to, whether it be peanut butter or C4 or heroin, right? And I can train that dog to track a person for 6 miles through the woods in a swamp. And I can train that dog to bite somebody and release when I tell him to. How is it that I couldn't train my brain to avoid panic attacks? Right. So I started thinking about that, and it evolved into another thing. And now I said, okay, hey, we can come up with the ritual and talk about this is how to turn off your hypervigilance when you get home at the end of shift, right? Using Pavlovian conditioning, my panic attacks used to be so fierce, Pat, I passed out. I would just lose conscience, fall. I don't know how many times I'm waking up, my wife sitting next to me going, it'll be all right, right? Because it got so normal. I got so fed up with it. I said, okay, I call myself being a bright person. I think I'm a fairly intelligent guy. So I put in to stop my anxiety attacks. Some research, all of a sudden I develop basically a little process of using candy and the use of sour candy at certain stages. And by doing that, I've taught my brain anxiety, panic attacks are not necessary, because if you do it, there's a particular candy that is so freaking sour that it literally draws your face up like a cartoon as soon as you put it in your mouth. And in the 99 or in the last book, Don't Be a Dick, and I'll talk about this part a little bit. This is what I refer to as my nuclear option. I first go and I start 4 square breathing if I have a panic. I'm starting to feel an anxiety attack coming on. Okay. Sit down, 4 square breathing. It's not working. Can I read? Can I focus? If I can focus, part of my process, I open my Bible and begin to read. This changes my brain thoughts. Okay, but I use my Bible. I don't use anything else. This way, this is pure. Okay, I'm not looking at pornography or nothing like that. This process has to be pure. Okay, if my reading's not working, then I put in an extreme sour warhead piece of candy in my mouth and I suck on it. Those aren't as sour as they want you to believe. It may work on some people, it may not. At the end of that, it has kind of a little sweet taste. Okay, great. But then I had times where that didn't work. And I said, okay, well, then my wife goes, she says, hey, I found this really sour candy. Well, okay, so she ordered it, we tried it. And now my brain says, if you go into a panic attack, we're going to do this. Right? And so through Pavlovian conditioning, Pat, I've taught my brain panic attacks are not acceptable in this world, Haas. And if you do it, there's going to be a sour repercussion to it. When you live your life through anxiety and you can't, right? This goes back to who can be a teacher. Now I've extracted my teaching that I've learned over the years and I've facilitated in this. Will this process work for everybody? I can't answer that. What I can tell
I've
you,
got a name for it already, though.
what is that?
Dirty Dick's Sour Patch Protocol.
I love that, man. That's awesome.
See,
That's
there's my
awesome.
creative brain at work. I can't help
There you
it.
go. I'll put it. I'm gonna.
That is pretty fascinating. We're gonna have to. All right, episode 2. We're gonna talk about Dirty Dick's Sour Patch Protocol.
There you go.
Soon, we got about 4 or 5 days to trademark that before this episode
Right.
goes live. So by the time listeners get on it, it's our, don't even try. It's going to be gone.
But it's the amazing things that we can do when we stop and slow down and say, these are my life experiences and this is what I know. How can I take dog training and stop anxiety, panic attacks? And then, okay, I did it. This is amazing for me, but I want everybody else to know about it, right? Panic attacks start small. They can start as a simple stare into nothing. You ever seen one of your buddies standing around, they're like staring at the wall and you go, hey man, you okay? Everybody's had that happen. This happens occasionally from our mind drifting, but it can also be a sign, it can be a panic attack, right? Well, if we grab it then and we recognize it, we can really curb that. So I think taking our life experiences and learning what we know and taking that and turning it into something that somebody can read a book and walk out there and go, wow, this works. That's the goal, right? I mean, Andy Hughes has been, when I decided to start writing that first book, whatever reason, I called Andy Hughes and I hadn't talked to him in a while, right? Andy ended up becoming a peer counselor for spiritual warfare for me. I'll say that way. He's had a great impact in my life in the last year in my faith. And then I got Tammy Featherstone in South Florida. Tammy's going to write a chapter she's a retired officer or a sergeant down there in South Florida. She's writing a chapter about spouses, right? She's a female law enforcement officer. She's going to write from her point of view. Feminine voice is very important in my book, all of my books, because it's a male dominant environment, but women live here and we need to make sure that we recognize that. And they have just as much, or sometimes and often more value than the men, right?
Absolutely.
And so John Kelly's writing a chapter about peer support. Jeff Dawkins is writing a chapter in this book about courageous nobility, right? I mean, so Olivia Johnson and Joy Crouch, the two doctors, I talked to you one time about the little Freud thing that I did.
Right.
I lucked out and found 2 psychiatrists that actually wanted to do it, right? So I said, okay, so they're actually writing a chapter, and that's why the book is more important to me than ever, Pat, because I feel like, and maybe I'm being a little more than, it's a book that you should be able to read and walk out of it with a solution in hand that works for you is the hope, right? So, things like Dirty Dick's Sour Patch Protocol.
All right.
That's
Hey, we're gonna have to wrap this up because otherwise we're gonna head into another 2-hour episode here. But
Okay.
hey, I really appreciate you spending some of your valuable time with us. Thinblueconnect.com. You can also find uh, Richard Odom on LinkedIn, and look for his books. Look for his books on Amazon or through LinkedIn or his website. And yeah, thank you, sir. Appreciate
I,
it.
I enjoyed it thoroughly, and maybe you'll invite me back one day.
Oh, absolutely. We got to talk about the Sour Patch Protocol.
Oh, I know. I am so excited about that. I want somebody to call me one day and say, dude, that's so work.
All right, everyone. Till the next episode, we're gonna be 1042.